the main thing we're going to talk about today is the background of ancient Greece. I'm going to kind of go into the early period of ancient Greece, mostly covering like the Greek Bronze Age. That's pretty much mostly what I'm all going to just cover today in today's class. I'll kind of go through and I'll talk about the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, which are part of this period that has different names, called the Greek Bronze Age. It's also called the so-called Aegean Civilization. It's what they dub it as well. So that's pretty much all I've got today. I'm going to cover. Then I will have a few minutes I can kind of review real quick, of course, on those sections. So anyway, I want to first talk about of course, ancient Greece as a culture overall. It is, of course, one of the first European civilizations that does develop, of course, in the ancient world. Go back, of course, really over 3,000 years ago. The Greeks, I guess, developed at least the early Greek culture developed about 3 to 3,500 years ago, about when it was overall. And Greece is important because it's kind of seen as the birthplace of Western civilization or Western culture. It's where we get like democracy, like they talked about, of course, in that little short video, and all the other things that the Greeks have kind of invented as well. And as a culture, it, of course, developed mostly in southern part of Europe, southeastern Europe, I guess, about be where it is roughly. And look at this map here I've got for you that you can look at right here, just right there. You can see that most of the geography of where Greece is predominantly between Turkey or Asia Minor, which is over here, and of course the Greek mainland. Most of the Greeks lived around the Aegean Sea or Aegean Basin, which is right here, a major sea. It's kind of between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, right there. And I believe it was the philosopher Plato that once remarked that basically the Greeks lived around the Aegean like frogs around a pond. The Greeks also lived like around the Black Sea area, like the southern coast of the Black Sea, Thrace, also over here, southern Italy, also in Sicily, just next part of Italy as well. So, yeah, Crete and all these areas pretty much in and around here was like a big Greek lake, where everybody lived pretty much. And so that was pretty much the period of, or geographic area where the Greeks actually lived. Also, want to also remark too, we're talking about Europe and all that. I do have a review question later, I guess, I did put up there, I think, for you. But origin of the term Europe, of course, since we're talking about European history, I guess we're getting into now. The word Europe originated from Europa. Europa was a mythological princess who was from Phoenicia. And of course, in the Greek story, she was kidnapped by the god Zeus. And Zeus brought her to Crete, which of course is in the bottom of the Aegean, near the part of the Mediterranean Sea there. And in the story, she later went on to marry one of the local Cretan rulers. And she became like the mother of like kings, like you may have heard of later, like King Minos, famous, ruler of Crete and all that the Greeks talk about later. And so Europa is kind of considered like the mother of Europe, where the word Europe, originated from a long time ago. All right, now, of course, I want to get into the Minoans here, talk about them as a culture. The Minoans developed in a period that's called different names. They of course, it says pre-Hellenic, which means pre-Greek age, which is kind of the period in the Bronze Age period before the Iron Age came in. And in that period, they call that the Greek Bronze Age, or the more common name they also call it now, which is Aegean Civilization, because of all these different cultures that first developed around the Aegean Sea in the Bronze Age. Two main ones you can see are Minoan, and then you have another one later called Mycenaean as well. So we'll talk about both of those, of course, today. The first one, of course, Hi, good afternoon. Um, the first one we're going to, of course, talk about is the Minoan culture. The Minoans, of course, was considered the oldest civilization of ancient Greece. They, of course, go back to the Greek Bronze Age, roughly over 3,000 years ago. The Minoans were considered like your first European civilization overall in culture. Most of their culture was based on a maritime culture. They were known for having great navies, great maritime trade. They've been often compared to the Phoenicians as well, which kind of come right after overall. They were mostly based in two areas. One, they were on the island of Crete first, just where they were pretty dominant. They had cities and palaces that they built there. They also had another area they lived in, which was in the southern Aegean, called the Cyclades. If you go back to that map that I just showed, let me blow it up. It's easier to see it that way. Of course, the Cyclades is right here. Then you got Crete. So pretty much the Minoans controlled pretty much this area here that was at the southern part of the Aegean, which was right there. There was an archaeologist that went there to Crete who became very famous. His name was Sir Arthur Evans. I think I got several pictures of Evans I can show you. Here's one right here. Evans, he's a British archaeologist, born in the 1850s, lived up to about 1940. He was pretty old when he died, close to 90. Evans was the one that went to Crete. He was going there to investigate the Mycenaean culture that everybody kind of knew about that time. But he was told that there was evidence that there might be some other culture there. So he went there and he discovered what became eventually the Minoan culture, that they will call it later. He would coin it, of course, later. So he discovered the Minoans. He also discovered this Cretan city and palace complex, which was there, that was called Knossos, which I've got a picture of. I can blow up for you on the screen. Where is Knossos? I've got at least this one here showing Knossos. Knossos was a combination of it was like a city. It was definitely a city on Crete, but it was part of a palace complex, which had hundreds of rooms in it. And he found it, I think, originally as a bunch of rubble. And then over time, what Evans did was he kind of tried to reconstruct it, which took something like 30, 40 years for him to rebuild it up to maybe around World War II and all that. And if you know about them on Crete, there was a famous king that we'll talk about more into later, which is King Minos. He may have ruled from that city, maybe as a city or capital at one point. There's even a throne room that they sometimes kind of call it the throne of King Minos, but they're not sure if he's a real person or not. The Greeks write a lot about him. And so what happened was Sir Arthur Evans decided to name the culture after him. And so they became known as Minoans, after King Minos overall. I've got some pictures, of course, of the palace complex. There it is, of course, the throne room of King Minos with the throne still there, supposedly. At least they think it was a throne, but they're just not sure if it was really his or not about that. Also, here's some other pictures right here that they've kind of rebuilt. Knossos was believed to have been multiple levels to it, with maybe apartments and so on. And there's also some kind of central court area that was in the middle, like a courtyard area that was in there. And then, of course, there's some pictures of the inside of it as well. You can see they may have used columns in the side of it as well. So a lot of this kind of construction you'll see later, in the Greek world. And I guess they're the first to really start developing what would be like early Greek architecture, which will be borrowed by other people, of course, later. Also, Evans, I guess I'll mention about it since we're talking. I'll come back to about the King Minos in a second, but Evans was the one that, besides coining the term Minoan, he also discovered their language, which he called it Linear A. And Linear A was a type of pre-Greek language, which was written on mostly tablet form. I think it had used up to 80 symbols as far as they know, but it's been pretty much undecipherable. I think I've got images of Linear A, which I can show you, but it's looks like chicken scratched, I think, to people today. They haven't been able to translate it. They think that Linear A was may have been one of the first European type languages that may have existed. They think it influenced Linear B later, which was a Mycenaean language, which they have been able to kind of translate. But like I said, it's unknown. They can't translate it, which is a big problem. And so most of Minoan culture is predominantly, most of the information comes from archaeology or from whatever the Greeks said, about them. Now, I did want to talk about the story of King Minos, which is, one of the most famous stories, associated with the Minoans, and of course, the story of King Minos. And supposedly he's connected to the legend of the Minotaur, which I'll kind of go and tell the story real briefly, as I did in the 10 o'clock lecture. But the Greek legend, there's a story where King Minos had this white bull that he had, and he was supposed to sacrifice it to the god Poseidon. However, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to keep it for himself. And so Poseidon got angry about this, and he had his wife, whose name was Pasiphae, lust after the bull. And so eventually she ended up having sex with a bull. And the offspring, of course, was this monster, which was like mostly a bull. It was a bull monster that was like part bull, part man. So like a hybrid. And so being such a horrible monster, offspring, he decided to put it somewhere, block it away. So he put it in a labyrinth or maze that was, they think, part of the palace complex. And suppose he was a man-eater. He ate people. And so every so often, they would give sacrifices to it. I think every 9 years they would feed it 7 boys and 7 girls to be eaten alive. And I believe it was the city-state of Athens that had to pay the tribute of sending the boys and the girls. And one time, Theseus, you see there, Theseus, who was the son of the king of Athens, who was named Aegeus, disguised himself as a boy, and he came to, of course, Knossos, and he was able to get into the labyrinth using used a ball of yarn to go in there, find the Minotaur, kill it, and then get out. So that's the story of the Minotaur. It's probably a made-up story that the Greeks, made up about, the Cretans or Minoans, and kind of like propaganda, because I guess they hated them. They were kind of like rivals to them or whatever, and so that's probably why they made these stories up. But there's a lot of stories about bulls that are associated with the Minoan Cretan culture that was down there. That's something, of course, you see a lot. Like you see paintings of bulls and things like that in their palace. Like they've got the famous Minoan bull leaping fresco that they're well known for. The Minoans are very, very famous for doing fresco paintings, which are these lime plaster paintings that they would put on walls in their home, not just in palaces, but in homes. They did this quite a lot. So they're very colorful people, very peaceful people, Minoans, not very warlike at all. And most of their paintings depict peaceful beings in their way of life in general. They think the bull leaping fresco is some kind of depiction of what was either called bull leaping or bull jumping, which was some kind of acrobatic sport where men or boys would jump on the backs of bulls, like balance themselves and jump off. It was kind of like a sport, like an early version of like bullfighting or something like that, that they kind of invented. And no one's invented several sports, that and boxing, and they think wrestling, as far as they know overall. But they have all kinds of depictions of art all over the place in the palace. I'll show you some more. Of course, right here they have you've got the Minoan frescoes like that one. Here's one, a bunch of frescoes, but those depict several things, of course. You've got birds on the left, of course. Here's a fisherman in the middle here. You see, they don't wear a whole lot of clothes, which is something that was true about the Minoans, they think, because it's a very, very warm climate. Two boys boxing, they think. Here's a painting of three women, Minoan women, with their stylish hair. Also, Minoan women were known for not wearing too many tops. So they actually exposed their breasts, which is something we don't see too much in Western culture. See it elsewhere, like Africa, Asia, maybe Latin America, but not there usually. What else? Here's a famous painting in Knossos in the palace complex. They got the famous blue dolphins. You may have seen that before, which is very well known. There's one here of some painting of, they're not sure who it is, but it depicts some Minoan. Maybe he was a prince. I don't really know who he was. They have no idea. But you can see, they, like I said, they didn't wear too many clothes. And looks like the men had their hair real long, you can see. Minoans are also known, let me show you right here, but they're known for, where was it? The picture I wanted to show you. Minoan pottery is something you see quite a lot in the Minoan world. And they were known for exporting a lot of olive oil and wine as well. Because they believed that the Minoans traded with like the Egyptians. They traded with probably Cyprus and pretty much throughout the Aegean basin overall. Hello. Anyway, so just kind of talk about the Minoan culture and who they're what they're famous for. Now, one more thing I did want to talk about the Minoan culture, just something that's kind of a big mystery today, of course, about the Minoans, and that's, of course, what happened to the Minoans and all of that. They eventually declined as a culture, like just overnight, just vanished, kind of like the Maya happened to them, or maybe that other culture I told you about, like the Indus Valley civilization. Apparently they think the Minoan culture was wiped out by some kind of volcanic eruption that occurred in the Aegean basin. It's often called the so-called Thera eruption, Thera, Thera eruption. They're not sure exact time of when it is, but they think it was either in the end of the 17th century or early part of the 16th century when it happened. So 1600 BC might be about when it was, circa when it was. They do know where it was. It happened on the island of Santorini, which I think the Egyptians called it Thera. It's called all kinds of names, Santorini, a long time ago. And apparently there was a Minoan port city there that was pretty important called Akrotiri. And that's what the Greeks called it. And what happened was this volcano blew up, destroyed and buried that city. And then they believe what happened was they think that huge tidal waves, which I guess we now call tsunamis, were created by the violent, volcanic eruption. If you go to Santorini, there's a big hole in the middle where the volcano was. And they think the tsunamis then pushed southward where they basically wiped out Crete. And they've actually found evidence of tsunami debris halfway up their tallest mountain on Crete, which is Mount Ida, IDA. Mount Ida. That's crazy. You found debris halfway up the mountain. So pretty much wiped them out as a culture. And of course, years later, there was a story that Plato wrote, you may have heard of, which is, of course, the famous Atlantis story. You may have heard about this, which Plato wrote in like two different philosophical works. Apparently, the story of the Minoan destruction was discovered by the Egyptians. They actually told the Greeks about it, and the Greeks took secondhand stories, they think, and they kind of developed this whole Atlantis story, which Plato wrote down. And so in the Atlantis story, Atlantis was supposed to be this great civilization that lived hundreds of years before the Greeks were around. And overnight, it was destroyed. It sank into the sea and all that. And so Plato thinks that pretty much this Atlantis story may have been a real thing. But, of course, he thought it was in the Atlantic Ocean, they believe, because hence the name Atlantis and all that. So who knows? It's kind of hard to say about that, but it's likely that that's the connection, between the whole Atlantis story and what happened to the Minoans, and it's all the same thing, just kind of written in a different version, basically. So that's what happened to the Minoans. They got snuffed out by a volcano, and I think they had I think after that there were earthquakes on Crete and all that, and that's why a lot of the Knossos and other sites were pretty much just rubble, I think, when Evans and others went there to start excavations and all that. So that was the Minoan culture. Let me go ahead and, of course, move on. Of course, we're going to get to next, and I'm going to talk about the Mycenaean culture that came in, of course, next. The Mycenaean culture was a culture that was around the same time as the Minoan one was. It was known actually as the Helladic period, or Helladic culture, whatever you want to call it. The Mycenaean culture was a type of pre-Greek Bronze Age culture, which mostly lived on the mainland of Greece. What was like the Aegean, also the Aegean area as well, because they went in, if you know about it, the Mycenaeans conquered the Minoans, what was left of that culture that was there. And they think the Mycenaean culture was not an original culture. It was believed to be some kind of retrograde culture that was probably influenced by the Minoans. Even their language and all that was influenced by them. They peaked, you can see, 16th to about the 12th century. They go up to about maybe 1200 or so, and the Greek Bronze Age collapse, the Bronze Age collapse comes in later, and their culture, pretty much declines drastically as well. Now, what we know about the culture, Mycenaean culture, they actually knew about that culture before the Minoan one. So that's something that is true about that. Arthur Evans was one of the first to discover their language, which was called Mycenaean language, or Mycenaean Greek. They call it different names. He called it Linear B. And Linear B was a type of pre-Greek language, which was similar to Linear A, but a little different. Although they have been able to translate that one, they do think that Linear B is one of the languages that would lead into what is the Archaic Greek, or we call Old Greek. You'll see later what happens is the Greek language develops from a combination of the Linear B, probably Linear B and probably Phoenician. That's pretty much how it kind of would evolve over time, which you'll see later. By the time of Homer, they start perfecting the Greek language. You start seeing different dialects of it come in over time. I do have some pictures, of course, of Mycenaean Greek. Here's, of course, a picture of Linear B, which you see there, which I think they had up to, I want to say 200 symbols, which you can see that was also written on tablet form as well, like Linear A was. Here's some images, of course, of Mycenaean Greece. Of course, that site you're looking at is the famous site of what is called Mycenae. Mycenae, of course, is really considered to be one of the greatest of the different Greek cities that would flourish under the Mycenaean period. It's where they get the name Mycenaean, which evolves over time. So they are famous, these Greek cities, mostly in southern Greece, where they were. And Mycenae, which I'll show you in a second more, was mostly in the northeastern part of what they call the Peloponnese. The Peloponnese is what they call the southern part of Greece. Today, also called the Peloponnesus. They call it as well. The Mycenaeans were known for constructing cities that were heavily fortified, like fortified walls. They were built around them. They also usually built them on hilltops, like a lot of Greek cities are built like that. The so-called Greek polis, or city-state, as they'll call them later. So a lot of their cities were almost like a citadel, the way they were constructed. And the one you're looking at in the picture there, which is Mycenae, of course, is the most famous of the Greek cities that would flourish at that time, or the Mycenaean period. And it's famous for its Greek architecture, which was copied later by other people. Of course, the most famous thing, which I'll get to in a second, is its front entrance. It's very well known for the so-called Lion or Lion's Gate. That's there still today. It's also known for what was a palace complex. It was part of it as well. It also included various tombs and grave sites that they pretty much excavated and explored as well. They believe that Mycenae was ruled by this dynasty of rulers that was called sometimes the House of Atreus, which they've written plays about and stuff like that. And the most famous king, of course, of the House of Atreus was King Agamemnon, who was a famous character, you know, in the Trojan War. He's in the Iliad and all of that. And he had a brother named Menelaus, who was later also the king of Mycenaean Sparta as well. It's not the same as the later Sparta, though. So that's basically kind of like some background on the Mycenaean culture. So they have a very warlike culture, the Mycenaeans. They had kings that were called usually called a Wanax, W-A-N-A-X, or actually just Anax, I think they actually say it. And they're kind of like these kings that were kind of like generals in a sense. All right. Let me also show you, let's see what else I've got to see right there. Yeah, of course, there's the Lion Gate, which is very famous. That, of course, is the main entrance into Mycenae. Of course, it's really one of the most famous architectural features of the Mycenaean period. And it has kind of like this coat of arms in the middle, which acts as a keystone to hold up the front entrance of it, which is right here where you see the arches into it to get into the entrance into it. And yeah, it depicts these two lions with a column in the middle. And so I guess some people think maybe it's like a coat of arms for maybe the House of Atreus or whatever dynasty that reigned over it really as a whole. And one thing that's famous about the construction of Mycenae and a lot of their cities is that they were built in the same kind of construction, using like architectural masonry, where they just stack up stone with I don't think they use mortar, which is interesting about that. Of course, the old joke about the way it was constructed is that it was built by the one-eyed monster Cyclops. And so they often talk about the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae. I think they even stacked boulders on the inside of it. In other places, it would stack boulders up. So in that matter, which is different as well. Heinrich Schliemann, who I do want to talk about, of course, was very famous for being involved in a lot of the excavations at a lot of these sites like Mycenae, also Troy, if you know about that. They think Schliemann was one of the first to go to ancient Troy, which is in Turkey, and do some archaeological work there. Heinrich Schliemann was German. He was a former merchant and world traveler. And after he retired from being a merchant, he started to get into archaeology, which was kind of a new field at the time. And so Heinrich Schliemann is kind of known in the 19th century as one of the early pioneers in archaeology, which, by the way, broke off from anthropology. And he was controversial, Schliemann. Like, he was very intelligent. Like, he knew multiple languages, was never college educated, although he got, I think, honorary degrees from different people, I believe, later. And he was known for using dynamite, which is kind of controversial. Like, when you clear out a certain section, you would basically blow it out with like dynamite, because dynamite had just been invented by Alfred Nobel, I believe, who created the ingredients for nitroglycerin. And so that was something he was kind of known for, using dynamite, stuff like that. So that was Heinrich Schliemann, and Schliemann believed that Schliemann was big into the poetry of Homer, the Greek poet. He wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he really believed that those stories told by Homer were true. They weren't made up stories, mythology, or anything like that. And so he actually used the stories of Homer to find a lot of these places and excavate them, and so on. He did some work, I think, with the Tholos tombs, which is kind of well known at the Mycenaean site, which I'll show you. Tholos tombs are these beehive-shaped tombs that the Mycenaeans constructed for like nobility and like kings. This one was called the Treasure of Atreus. At least that's what I think Heinrich Schliemann called it exactly. And they would bury the king in there and put treasure in there with them. If you go on the inside, it looks like a beehive, honeycomb shape to it. So that's where it gets the name Tholos from originally. They built these at different sites overall, and I forget what king he thought was buried in there. Atreus or maybe Agamemnon may have been buried in there, at one point, but we're not really sure about that. Also, the other thing he was very famous for at Mycenae was the so-called grave circles that he found there too. The grave circles were these graves of like Mycenaean nobility. But maybe Agamemnon may have been buried in there too. He may have thought possibly he wasn't buried in that other tomb. And they used like a system of what they call shaft graves, where they would dig a shaft down and they would bury people in there, and then they would inter people with a lot of their personal artifacts. Like they found like their armor on their body. They found shields, swords, daggers, trinkets and cups, rings, and so on. And Schliemann also found, which was very famous, the so-called, it's called the Mask of Agamemnon. She found in 1876. He claims it was Agamemnon's baby. I don't know about that, but it could have been, I guess, maybe some Mycenaean nobleman, probably overall. In fact, he found a lot of gold artifacts in there. They found actually solid gold daggers in the grave, which is solid gold cups, things like that. So really expensive stuff. And I think later they inspected like a lot of the skeletons of these noblemen that were buried there, and a lot of them had a lot of back problems because they had to carry those heavy shields in battle. So a lot of the nobility were involved in a lot of war, I guess, apparently, like Agamemnon and so on. Of course, the other thing that Schliemann is very famous for, Schliemann also went to Troy as well, which is called later, it's called Hisarlik. I'll bring it up for you if you want. Hisarlik, trying to think where that is. It's in there somewhere. I posted it. I don't know if I find it or not. Oh, there it is. Supposedly, that's the site of the Trojan War, which is in northwestern Turkey. It's where it is now part of the Republic of Turkey. So I think he went there. excavated that. Schliemann was influenced by this man named Frank Calvert, who was an American, told him about it. And so Schliemann thought, oh man, that's where, Homer's Troy is. They talk about the Iliad. So he went to Turkey there. In the 1870s, he began excavating that site there. And this site evidently had been used by a lot of people for hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, Sarlik is a word that supposedly means place of fortifications. That's what it means. Anyway, there was a story where he found like a bunch of gold treasure buried in the wall. This was in 1873. This is right before he went to Mycenaean. He went to Troy first, then Mycenaean, Heinrich Schliemann. He called it Priam's treasure. It was actually inside one of the walls you're looking at there in that picture. And he claims it was some remnants of the treasure of the Trojans that controlled the city a long time ago. He pulled all these artifacts out like those you're looking at in the picture. His wife looks like is wearing, Helen Schliemann is wearing some of the jewelry also as well. So whether that's really Trojan, they're not sure. I think he later would take it back to Germany and all of that. But it's been a big debate about that. I think they did some dating on it, and they're not sure if it's the same time period or not. And of course, they're not sure when the Trojan War, actually happened. That's the last thing I wanted to talk about today, of course, which is the Trojan War. Let me, of course, get into that because, like I said, that site of Hisarlik, which is in Turkey, northwestern Turkey, is supposedly the site of where the Trojan War happened, which they think happened about 1200 BC. And the Trojan War was like this Greek mythological war. That's what they often called it. That took place between the Greeks, which were called Mycenaean later, but Homer called them Aegean, of course, was the term he used, Aegean. And of course, the Trojans with their city-state of Troy, which was in northwestern Turkey, like I said. And these stories are based, of course, on the stories of Homer, who was a Greek poet living several hundred years later, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is about the Trojan War period, both of those. Iliad is about the Trojan War, and then the Odyssey is about King Odysseus, his adventures after the war, trying to get home back to Ithaca, of course, in Greece. We won't really talk much about that book, but we'll talk about, of course, the Iliad today, about that. Of course, Homer, there's a big debate about when Homer lived. They're not sure exactly when Homer lived. Herodotus believed that Homer lived in the 9th century BC. About, like you say, he lived about 400 years before he did, which would put it about that time, the 9th century, which is a possibility. I think the video said, I thought it said 8th century maybe, which I'm not sure about that, if that's correct or not. But I know anywhere from like around 8th, 9th century is kind of popular, I know. Of course, there's a big debate about who Homer was. Most people, debate about whether Homer existed or not. Maybe there's more than one person that was writing these epics down or whatever. They do know that Homer may have been a bard poet, but he may have been blind. That's been one, story that they sometimes talk about, which how is he going to write it down? So maybe somebody wrote it down from him, what he said overall. Of course, Homer claims that the whole Trojan War started over a woman. You know about this. They always talk about the face that launched 1,000 ships. That, of course, was Helen of Troy. The story. She was the wife of King Menelaus of Sparta, who was the brother of Agamemnon. And, of course, in the story in Homer's Iliad, Paris takes Helen back to Troy as his wife. According to them, of course, Greeks stole her. And of course, the Trojans said that she went willingly. So it didn't really like, I guess, Menelaus. And they believe that the story developed from, they think, some kind of quarrel among the goddesses of the Greeks, the Greek goddesses. There was a story about how the Greek goddesses were kind of debating like who was the most fairest, most prettiest of the Greek goddesses. And so they asked Paris to choose who was the most beautiful overall. They gave him this apple called the apple of discord. It was a gold apple. And Paris, if you know about it, chose Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and beauty. And she chose Helen of Troy, who was supposed to be the most beautiful woman at the time in Greece. And so that's how Helen ended up with Paris, and all that later. Of course, because of that, because Helen gets taken, back to Troy, Agamemnon, the brother of Menelaus, steps in. He declares war on the Trojans at that point. So he's the one that kind of amasses the force together, gets the ships together to cross the Aegean to fight the Trojans. They believe that the Trojan War was a 10-year war, 10-year siege. And Homer mostly covers only a short period of like the end of the war, maybe a few months of it, they think. He goes more into like the 10th year of the war and doesn't cover the whole thing and all of that. So there may have been other stories associated with the war which don't exist anymore. And some stories are told later from the Roman perspective, like Virgil, the Roman poet who wrote the Aeneid, who kind of continued the story, of course, later. There's different characters in the Iliad, which, these may have been real people or not. They're not sure. But on the Greek side, those are the most famous ones. Of course, King Agamemnon, of course, the king of Mycenaean. You have his brother Menelaus, king of Sparta. These are, of course, the Mycenaean cities like this we're talking about now. Achilles was the king of the Myrmidons, and he was considered to be the greatest Greek warrior on their side, or Greek hero. When he's fighting, they're invincible, of course, the Greeks. Achilles was famous for his being part god and being invincible almost, except at his Achilles heel, where he was vulnerable. Odysseus was the king of Ithaca. He was involved as well in the war. And Odysseus was later famous for the story of the Iliad. He was involved in that. And then, according to Homer, and then Odysseus was, of course, very famous for coming up with the Trojan horse idea, which later led to the demise of the Trojans. Trojans had different famous people. Priam, of course, was the famous king of Troy. So he was the enemy, Agamemnon. Hector and Paris were his two sons, his heirs. Hector, the oldest one and heir to the throne. Hector was also the best warrior on the Greek side. Hector became famous later, for fighting Achilles, single combat, which, of course, he lost and got killed, as you know. And Paris was his younger brother, of course, the one that started the war when he, of course, took Helen. So that's kind of like, just kind of in a nutshell, the characters that were involved in it. But that whole story about, Odysseus and the Trojan horse, that's, of course, a story that's told later by the Romans. Of course, the Roman poet Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, would later write about that from, I guess, stories that were previously there. And so it's possible that that's how maybe the Greeks won the war, but it might be a made-up story. They really don't know about that. The Trojan War was the peak of the Mycenaean period, because they would decline later. We'll get more into it later, but there's going to be a Bronze Age collapse that will happen close to about 1200. That happens throughout the Mediterranean Sea. And, of course, I talked about the sea peoples and all that later that they have that kind of come in. It's possible that the people that conquer Greece and the Aegean Basin may have been somehow related to the sea peoples. They're not sure exactly about that or not, but it's going to bring on a dark age, which I'll get more into later, I guess on Wednesday next week. And Greece kind of goes through a period of decline for about a couple hundred years, where the culture is not like what it used to be, like under the Mycenaean, Minoan culture. And then what's going to happen is they'll have a culture come in called the Hellenes, the Hellenic or Greek peoples. Like the word Hellen means Greek, by the way. So that's where the word Greece or Greek comes from. And they'll develop in the Iron Age. And they're the ones that kind of start the Hellenic Age, as they call it, or Greek Age, which really won't start probably till close to maybe the 8th century, possibly. That's when it starts. Yeah, about, at least let's say theorized close to when the Olympics started. Maybe right before that, close to about 800 BC, roughly. So I'll get more into it later about the different Greek cultures, that were basically there. So anyway, so yeah, that's, and of course, like I said, Schliemann later came there, to that site, Troy, and so it's possible that Hisarlik, like I said, might be the site of Troy, but it's still controversial. Some people think yeah, and some people think maybe not, because of those. I guess all those artifacts they found, they did some dating on it, and it didn't seem to match up to that period. And one thing about Hisarlik, I didn't get into a lot about it. It means place of fortifications. It's what it means in Turkish. And they believe Hisarlik was some kind of fortified city that was built on an artificial hill. They call it Tell, Tell. And evidently it had been used as some kind of fortified city going back to the time of the Hittites. So a long, long time ago. So there's been multiple cities, maybe like 9 cities that have been built on top of each other. And Schliemann believes that Troy 7, like the 7th city, I guess more to the bottom of it, is likely maybe the Trojan city, but like I said, they don't know. Right, let me spend a little bit of time also reviewing as well, of course, on the just the stuff we've lectured today about. That won't take long. I'll go into a few minutes on that, maybe 10 minutes at the most. And that'll be it for today. And then on Wednesday, of course, I'll continue with part 2, of course, on this period of ancient Greece. Now, like it says there, around what seeded mostly ancient Greece developed as one of the first European civilizations. Of course, that was, of course, the Aegean Sea, which is based, I told you, between Turkey and the Greek mainland. It's where most of the Greeks eventually live in the Greek world, later spread out elsewhere, of course, outside of that. But that's pretty much the heart of where the Greeks live. What mythological figures Europe named after? Of course, Europa, who was believed to be some kind of Phoenician princess from a long time ago that was kidnapped by Zeus, supposedly. What is the historical name for early Greek history when the Minoans and Mycenaeans flourished? It's called multiple names, either called the Greek Bronze Age, or the common name now is the Aegean Civilization, which ended about 1200 BC, roughly. Who were the Minoans? The Minoans were a type of pre-Greek culture, in the Greek Bronze Age, that lived in the Aegean Basin, mostly like on Crete, Cyclades, and other Aegean islands. And they were considered one of the first Europeans that were part of a type of maritime civilization or culture. They were known for sea trade, like the Phoenicians. What main island they developed in southern Aegean? I told you the island of Crete was like one of their main islands. They were also in the Cyclades. Who was the archaeologist that discovered the Minoans? What palace did he excavate in the early 1900s? That was Sir Arthur Evans from Britain. He, of course, discovered the Minoan sites around 1900. And he was known for excavating the site of Knossos, which was believed to be some kind of Minoan palace and city complex that was part of Crete, on Crete. It may have been where King Minos ruled. And so, yeah, that was the king associated with the Minoans, according to the Greeks a long time ago, King Minos, who may have been a real person or not. What famous legend associated with this king, King Minos? The legend of the Minotaur, which is told by the Greeks, that bull monster. What was the main language discovered by Evans? It was called Linear A, is what he called it. It was considered like a type of pre-Greek language before Linear B and Greek would show up later. What type of artwork were the Minoans famous for in their palace and homes? They were known for fresco paintings, like lime plaster paintings, like the bull leaping one you saw that was, the most famous. What caused the Minoans to decline? The Minoans were believed to have been wiped out by a catastrophe, which was possibly like the volcanic eruption on the island of Santorini, which was often called the Thera eruption. I think that eruption also created tsunamis that destroyed like Crete and all that. So basically, natural catastrophes is what wiped out the Minoans. What legend or myth is kind of associated with their decline? They think that Plato's story of Atlantis might be connected to the Minoan decline. They think it might be the same thing, just told in a different way. Who are the Mycenaeans? Where are they developed in Greece? The Mycenaeans were another pre-Greek culture developed in the Bronze Age, mostly on the Greek mainland. So they were mostly predominantly like in the southern part of Greece, like in the Peloponnese, like the southern part of Greece, like where Sparta will be in that area. What main language did they adopt that was similar to the Minoan writing? The Mycenaeans developed Linear B, which Sir Arthur Evans coined. And Linear B was believed to be like a type of pre-Greek language that they think influenced later Greek. I think Greek evolved from that and probably Phoenician, likely. And both of them are written on tablets, mostly. What types of cities were they famous for building? The Mycenaeans built these cities or city-states that were built on hilltops, and they were heavily fortified, kind of like almost like a citadel, some of them. Most famous, of course, was Mycenae, which was built in the northern part of the Peloponnese, northeastern part. So Mycenae, most famous one. And it's why they call it Mycenaean, the culture, because they don't know the original name, what they called them. Same thing with Minoans. Who is the German archaeologist who discovered and excavated sites such as Mycenae? Also, of course, the site of Troy as well down here. That, of course, was Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann, of course, was considered one of the pioneers in archaeology, especially dealing with Mycenaean culture in general, which people began discovering in the 1800s. What was the Lion Gate? The Lion Gate was the main entrance into the city of Mycenae, and it's considered one of the greatest, I guess, first major architectural feature that you see with the Greeks is that. Because a lot of that's copied later, stuff like that. What tombs were discovered by Schliemann? Well, Schliemann was involved in mostly finding the grave circles that were there, but he also discovered, or actually excavated, maybe some of the where the Tholos tombs were, which were those beehive-shaped tombs that were built for the nobility. So they had the Tholos tombs, and they had the grave circles, which were built for like Mycenaean nobility. What epic poems were the Greek poet Homer famous for writing? Of course, I told you he wrote the Iliad, which is mostly about the Trojan War, which may have happened around 1200 BC. And then he also wrote the Odyssey, which is about the adventures of King Odysseus after the war ended. What was the Trojan War? It is believed to be like a type of Greek mythological war between the Greeks, which were called the Achaeans by Homer. We call them now Mycenaean, versus the Trojans, who were based in northwestern Turkey, they think. They call it Troy. By the way, the word Iliad, if you want to know, comes from the Greek word Ilios, which is what the Greeks called Troy. What else? What was its main cause, according to Homer? They believe that the Trojan War was sparked by Helen of Troy, who was taken by Paris back to Troy as his wife. And so, like I said, it was the war that launched 1,000 ships due to her face, and all that. So yeah, a face that launched 1,000 ships. So yeah, the Trojan War, which will last 10 years. roughly. But like I said, Homer doesn't really write too much about the whole war, except just a small part of it in general. And the later parts, the end of it, are written by other writers later, like Virgil, the Roman poet. Who were major characters in the Iliad? I told you about Agamemnon, of course, the king of Mycenaean. Of course, he had his brother Menelaus of Sparta. Also, they had Achilles, who was the greatest Greek hero and warrior on their side. And then you had also, I told you about Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, who was also one of the characters in the Odyssey, possibly written by Homer as well. Odysseus was also the one that came up with the whole story of, he came up with the whole Trojan horse idea to defeat the Trojans, which may or may not be true. They don't really know. Then the Trojan side, they had, I told you, King Priam was the king of the Trojans, and he had his two main sons, of course, Hector, their greatest warrior and hero, who was later killed by Achilles in single combat, and his younger brother, Paris, as well. They have other characters. I'm just kind of going through some of the ones that are the most famous and most important ones. It says at what Turkish site did Schliemann possibly discover ancient Troy? That, of course, was the site of Hisarlik. Hisarlik, which I told you about. Hisarlik might be Troy, which is, like I said, northwestern Turkey. Like I said, they're not sure about that. So it's kind of still debated today about that. So anyway, that's it for my lecture today overall. If you have any questions about this lecture, comments about it, let me know. Don't forget as well, at the beginning of the lecture, I talked about various assignments which are due this week. And I do have a new one I posted today, which is on ancient India. So check that out. Start working on that later. And then don't forget about vocab this week, which is also due as well. So that's it for today. Of course, on Wednesday, I'll try to continue talking about ancient Greece. I'll talk mostly about the rise of the Greek city-states. So that's it for today. Take care.